Well, I think it's going to be at least as good, super interesting topic, something that is near and dear to everyone's heart, which is, what is this going to mean for society? Okay, we certainly want to make good business decisions. We want to use our data well. We want to think about skills and training and all of that and market competition. But what is this going to do to our world? How is it, what are the potential pitfalls that we need to be thinking about? And I have two unbelievable panelists to talk this through with today. First up is Michiel Bakker. He's an assistant professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management and affiliated with the MIT IDSS, the MIT Institute for Data Systems and Society, as well as the Center for Constructive Communication at the MIT Media Lab. Michiel is an AI safety researcher and a computational social scientist. He focuses on AI alignment, the societal impacts of AI, and AI's role in human and human-computer interaction. He holds master's degrees and a PhD in computer science from MIT, and a bachelor's degree and master's degree in physics from Delft University of Technology. Please welcome Michiel Bakker. And our second panelist, Manish Raghavan, is the Drew Houston 2005 Career Development Professor and Assistant Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management and the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Center for Research on Computation and Society. His research centers on the societal impacts of algorithmic decision-making. And small note, he is a former student of Sendhil Mullainathan, who you saw on one of the first morning panels. Manish.
Thanks, Sinan.
All right, guys, I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you because I think this may be long-term, when people unearth the videos of this conference years from now, regarded as the most important panel, because it really gets away from, what should we do as managers to how are we going to deal with this as a society, as a species? And we've got a lot of really big problems to grapple with. We've got a lot of really important societal implications to really think deeply about. And the two of you have been thinking so deeply about these topics that I want the audience to be able to hear what you've been thinking about. And I, again, like in the first two panels, want to learn from the two of you because I love reading your papers, but sometimes the conversations are way more interactive and deep. And I just love that I get to do that as a colleague of yours every day at MIT. So I'm going to start with you, Michiel. So I have to make this the first question because we're very close into a big political event recently. And the question is this. We obviously live in a very politically and otherwise polarized world. But you were part of a team that developed and demonstrated the ability of an AI mediator to help humans find common ground, and then often motivated them to even update their views, which in this day and age, I don't know how you achieve that, after mediation to adopt a shared perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about this system and this research and the promise it may hold for bringing people together in this time of exceptional division?
Yeah, thanks, Sinan, for the question. So this is a paper that I worked on with a really awesome group of collaborators. It was recently published in Science. And what we do is that we build a system of language models. And it's a system, it's not a single language models, because the system sort of simulates an election and uses a social choice framework internally to ultimately bring a set of perspectives. So in text, you input a set of opinions. And then the system finds one group statement that maximizes some notion of agreement. So what the system basically does is that it tries to sort of reconcile different perspectives and find a statement that this group of people can agree on. Now, in the paper, it's obviously a research study. So we focus on small groups of people that try to find agreement on political issues, in our case. But this system has, I think, a lot of implications, and especially that it works so well, that it's obviously a much cheaper and more accessible way to do mediation than to have a professional mediator. So after we released this paper, this is about a month ago, we had a lot of inbound requests, all the way from sort of couples therapists to people that want to use this for big geopolitical questions. And now I have to emphasize that this is a research study, right? I don't know if this particular system is ready for prime time, but it does show the promise of using language models and using AI to sort of mediate human interaction. So to go from this sort of single agent, single human interaction that we often see with quote unquote chatbots to something that can mediate or help a group of people.
So does this, a lot of times we note in our society, especially for innovation, that, that differences of opinion can be good. We don't want to like homogenize everybody's opinion to some single shared perspective, but we want there to be some common ground. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between sort of just homogenizing everybody onto a single opinion and what you're trying to achieve here?
Yeah, so here, I think like we're not trying to get everyone to adopt the same opinion, but often finding consensus and finding agreement is sort of a prerequisite for collective action, right? So if you want to pass a bill, then there's one bill that you would pass, or if you want to, as a group of people, make a decision how to prioritize maybe the features for your product, there is only one feature you can build first, right? So in those kind of decision-making processes where you need to get to agreement on a single issue, I think there it's very useful. Then in addition, even when you don't want to get to sort of a single statement or a solution that you agree on, but just want to explore sort of the opportunity space, these models can really help with sort of finding ways to integrate different opinions in perhaps non-obvious ways. So I think for sort of both of those, right, we're not trying to homogenize opinions, but if you need to get to a collective decision, I think these systems have a lot of promise.
So consensus building is an important topic. Discrimination is another really important topic as it intersects with AI. And Manish, you've thought a lot about discrimination and how it may interact with AI. As we think about the differences, and we heard a lot about this even in the first panels, between supervised machine learning and generative AI, can you help us understand how each approach could exacerbate or alleviate discrimination in different contexts? And what's the difference between these two, supervised machine learning and generative AI? And how could each differentially affect the rates of discrimination in different ways, in, for example, hiring or in criminal justice outcomes? How do we think about developing and deploying generative AI in ways that steer it towards alleviating rather than exasperating discrimination?
Yeah, so I'll start with I'm glad you brought up that there's multiple different domains or contexts in which we're making sort of high-stakes decisions or doing things that could be considered discriminatory, because the way that we think about discrimination in employment is very different from how you think about it in criminal justice, different from how you might think about it in the medical context. And so our notions of discrimination have always had to be context-dependent. And one of the big challenges that we've always had with discrimination is it's very difficult to measure. Right? Especially, you interact with a judge or a doctor or someone like that, and maybe there's some amount of bias, and maybe you perceive it, but also it's very difficult to sort of quantitatively show that some sort of bias has been exhibited. And this, most of my work on this subject is actually in the context of employment, where there's a ton of precedent, a ton of legal precedent for people basically arguing over this fact. How do we define discrimination, and when is discrimination considered wrong? It was a little easier to port some of that legal reasoning over to the cases of supervised machine learning, because ultimately the way that a lot of these cases ended up getting resolved is you just look at statistically what are the outcomes that people were producing. Were those outcomes resulting in patterns that people found discriminatory? Now you can ask the same thing about supervised machine learning. You're making, you have a resume screener, you have some sort of like system of games that people interact with, and that leads to hiring decisions. But it's much more difficult to do that in the context of generative AI. We don't have these discrete binary decisions that we can quantitatively audit anymore, right? People are using chatbots to interview people, for example, and that chatbot makes a recommendation. Can you be convinced that someone's dialect or their employment history or whatever isn't affecting the chatbot's quote-unquote perception of them? Is that leading to discriminatory downstream outcomes? There have been a few of these audit studies done in sort of semi-synthetic settings where people find that, yes, actually, if a language model can make inferences about your demographics, that actually does steer them in different directions. Could that be considered discrimination? Probably. But do we have the tools to measure that yet? It's unclear. And so I think that's, this is, I think, a broader challenge that everybody's seeing with generative AI. It's super hard to evaluate. We don't even know what the right metrics to be accounting for are. The same is true in these socially salient settings like discrimination.
So what that says to me is that, again, supervised machine learning, you have labeled data, it is or it isn't. The machine then learns to predict when, in new cases, it is or it isn't. Generative AI, talk to someone during a job interview, and suddenly it's subtly different than had they been a man or a woman, or had they been older or younger or of a different race, and the outcome of the conversation, if you were to read the transcript, looks different. So it isn't is it a this or that? It is a much more subtle sort of thing to think about, which brings me to the fact that we have to build, train, and fine-tune these models. And as we build, train, and fine-tune these models, we have to think about how they align with the goals we're trying to achieve in society. And Michiel, you've been thinking a lot about this alignment problem applied to LLMs. And one problem is that LLM training data encodes biases that might show up in an LLM chatbot in a hiring scenario that may not align with human values or what we're trying to achieve as we think about human values. And you've been working on systems of LLM feedback and reward that can steer their output generating processes to incorporate minority views and represent a diversity of opinions. Can you describe how this works? Can you answer the perhaps thornier question of who gets to decide, because this came up on another panel, what version of human moral values AI should align with and why?
All right, I'll unpack. I'll try to unpack this question. So first, to build on Manish, whether it's supervised learning or generative AI, it all starts with having very good evaluations, right? And evaluations might be harder with generative AI, and metrics might be harder, but in some ways, for that reason, they're even more important, right? So you see a lot of investment, both in academia and in sort of AI research, around building better evaluations. There are these AI safety institutes in the UK, in the US, now in Europe, that are thinking about how we can evaluate this system. So evaluations and sort of the art and science of building good evaluations is a super important area also to sort of think about what are actually the harms or the biases or what is actually the output you want, right? So as an example, if you ask a question that maybe has some sort of political or social sort of foundation, you want the model to represent a plurality of viewpoints, right? So this is something you can evaluate at sort of the single output or single response level. You could say, well, for this question, these are sort of the opinions that exist in society. So if we ask the model this question, we want it to represent at least some subset, some broad subset of these opinions. But then there's also the question around sort of distributional biases, which is already much harder. So if you ask a model, write me a story about a doctor that cures a patient, and this doctor might always have the same demographic background. This is not something you can measure at the single sort of output response level, but is a measure that sort of only exists or is defined over a distribution of outputs. So I think it really starts with like defining what are sort of the potential downstream harms and how can we evaluate for those harms. And then in terms of sort of solutions or steering this model, depending on sort of what the potential harm is, so if it's distributional or if you're thinking about whether a single output represents a sort of plurality of viewpoints, there are different things you can do. So sort of the easiest one is to give the model demonstrations, right? So if you see that it only represents some subset of opinions in its answers, you can say, well, the next time you get a question like this, this is the answer that you should generate, right? And the model will then, over time, learn to generalize that always if it gets a question of this nature or of this topic, it will include or try to include these viewpoints. That's a very sort of almost like simple, or people call this supervised fine-tuning or supervised learning, where you say, this is the way you should answer on this question, and you hope that the model generalizes. Then there are really interesting, more technical solutions. So I think by now everyone in the audience has heard about RLHF as this way to sort of reward good behavior of the model. Well, in this sort of good behavior, there's also some definition of what good really is. So instead of having, for example, a single model that defines good behavior or bad behavior, maybe you have a set of models where each model represents a different group of people and how they might evaluate that answer. And then you can say, well, good behavior is not good according to one model, but is some sort of aggregation or summation or some mean or some function over this set of different models that represent different people. So this is sort of start with evaluation. There's a lot of work on methods depending on what sort of the issue with this model is. And then your final question, I think, was around the thorny who decides.
Yeah, I wasn't going to let you get away with not answering that one. Yeah. Who gets to decide? Does OpenAI set morality for society moving forward?
So obviously, that's not the outcome I think that we should want, nor the outcome that OpenAI wants, right? So I think often there's maybe this understanding that safety and capabilities are sort of in tension. And sure, sometimes they are in tension. But I think a company like Anthropic shows that if you build very safe systems, right, and if you make safety not only part of your brand, but also of the actual work you do and the research you do, that could actually lead to a lot of success with consumers, with businesses. And so building sort of safe and ethical systems and include different perspectives in sort of this alignment process could also, I think, lead to commercial success. Now there's also a question sort of why would you do it and how would you do it? And on the how, there's a lot of work from both academia and AI research on participatory processes to alignment. You can imagine that maybe if you operate in a lot of different countries or in a lot of different settings, that you have a different alignment process for the US than you have for India, right? And that there's, or for other countries around the world, so that there's maybe some data that you share, but then there's other sort of principles that you're trying to align the model to, depending on sort of how people in different countries think about how these models should be aligned or what kind of outputs they should generate.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about consensus, we've talked about discrimination, we've talked about alignment. Manish, I want to ask you about fairness. So I have an 11-year-old son who I'm convinced doesn't understand the meaning of the word fair. When I ask him to do his homework or his chores, he's convinced it's not fair. So we have to really think deeply about the definition of fairness, I tell him, and his eyes glaze over. So as a grown adult with a PhD from MIT, I was sure I understood the meaning of fairness until I read your work. Can you formally define the 3 dimensions of algorithmic fairness you discuss in your work on risk scoring, and explain to us why you think it's impossible to simultaneously satisfy all 3 dimensions, and what that means for how we navigate their trade-offs across these scoring dilemmas in society?
Yeah, so I actually don't know how to define fairness either. I guess So if you look through the sort of history of philosophy, economics, and more recently computer science, you find lots of people trying to positively define what it means to do things fairly. And you can look at all these different definitions and see which one you think is appropriate for a particular setting. In our work, one of the things that we had shown was that depending on, if multiple people want to define fairness in different ways, you're just not going to make all of them simultaneously happy. And I think one succinct way of describing it is something like if the world is unfair in some way, like we get data from the world does a lot of things that we may not agree with. If it is unfair or unequal in some way, that inequality is going to reappear somewhere else. So if you measure a system enough times from different angles, you're going to come across that inequality somewhere. And I think what that means is we need to be a lot more careful about how we actually think positively about what we want our systems to look like. And I think I've studied a lot of two sides of the same coin, right? Because discrimination is one way of defining here's what we do not want to happen. Mm-hmm. But the question of fairness is the opposite. So saying, okay, if we're not allowed to do this, what should we do instead? Mm-hmm. And often you find that these things are just kind of incompatible with each other because different people want different things, right? People look at the outcomes of a college admissions process. They might disagree on whether they think that was a fair college admissions process. We have a lot of disagreement in this society, and we also have a lot of inequality in this society, right? And to go back to our point about evaluation, what this really means is that we need to think really carefully about how we evaluate our systems. What are the constraints that we want to impose on them? What are the objectives that we want to give them? And what are the things that we're sacrificing along the way to do that, right? So, there's always going to be some tension between freedom of expression and tamping down on hate speech, right? These are going to intersect somewhere. This is not necessarily a question of fairness, but it is telling us that we're going to have to resolve all of these conflicts somewhere, and somebody has to be the one who's actually building the models and litigating these conflicts, so to speak. Actually, on the point of alignment, one of the things that it was reminding me of is a lot of these fights are fights that we had about content moderation, in a sense, about what people should be allowed to say, what people shouldn't be allowed to say. And if you look at how the big tech companies have done content moderation over the years, they've written thousands of pages of handbooks that they give to content moderators around the world and say, in this country, here's what you're allowed to say, here's what you're not allowed to say. In this country, we have different rules, and we're going to apply them differently. There's not really been a great consensus on this, and you've seen a little bit of sort of market segmentation for different platforms that have a market for rules in some sense. And I think what you were getting at is maybe we're going to get some amount of that in terms of alignment as well, where different firms are going to try to align their models in different ways. But yeah, to this question of fairness, I think it really just means that we're not going to all agree on what outcomes we want from a system, whether it's a supervised machine learning system, whether it's just a bunch of humans making decisions, whether it's generative AI, there is going to be disagreement, and somebody is going to have to positively resolve that disagreement.
So these dilemmas existed before Gen AI, is what you're saying.
And they will continue to exist long after.
So we're gonna take questions for the audience. So anybody with a question, raise your hand. We've got the roving mics, and if there is a question, we can take one now. I have plenty more questions if you guys are there. There's some back there. Yeah. Yeah, they're coming. Yeah. Thanks.
Ben Thompson from MIT. I just came in and heard this discussion about bias, so you may have touched on this issue, but wouldn't it be interesting to have the two versions of these LLMs debate with each other, or rather try to find solutions between their differences, different senses of fairness, given that they are still just machines, so or they are in that sense neutral, but they have the bias has entirely come from what they have absorbed, not from intelligence per se. Has anybody tried that, or?
I want to say, Ben, thank you for that question. It's a great question, and I want to just remind everyone that the human beings also are becoming biased based on what they're exposed to. We see this in kids, and with that, I'd love to hear your answer to this. Yeah.
I think this is really close to a lot of the work that you guys are doing currently.
Yeah. So I think this is a very interesting answer, or a very interesting question, and the answer is definitely yes. People have been looking at this, and in sort of AI safety, there is this sort of set of methods or ideas which are broadly sort of started by a paper called AI Safety via Debate. And the idea is, there it's specifically on sort of factuality, but the idea is that if you have a model that gives a response to a user, and this model's response is then critiqued by another model, and then this first model that has the response critique then can sort of write a sort of rebuttal, an argument why it's first. So they sort of have a debate with each other, and then there's ultimately a human that, or a person that decides who of these models wins the battle. And if you do then optimization against this, it sort of creates an incentive for the first model to give an answer to the user that is sort of truthful. Because if it's not truthful, then this other model can find holes in its answer, and therefore it will ultimately not win this sort of debate and will get a negative reward or a negative bonus at the end, and therefore you'll sort of optimize to make this model more truthful. So that's a very technical answer. But yes, there's a lot of work on this, both for applications in sort of making models more factual, but also in trying to integrate different opinions. So perhaps you can represent different sort of groups of opinions as models that then have debates with each other, and then see if maybe the answer that comes out that all these sort of models in simulation agree upon, or at least agree more than any alternative answer, to sort of surface this answer to the user, and in that way sort of integrate different opinions. So sort of letting language models have debates with each other is a very sort of active and exciting area of research.
I mean, I think as we're looking for the next question, so please raise your hand, just to reflect quickly on that. I think the system arguing for the human adjudicator on a factual basis being a sort of truth revelation type of system is very different when the debate is about opinions. It's not clear to me, and the debate about opinions that you described was one where the goal was integration, was trying to come up with a shared opinion. But if you were to say to two machines on an opinion debate, argue with each other with the goal of trying to win the favor of the human judge, I'm not sure whether the machines would become more extreme or more conciliatory. And it's not clear what the dynamics of that system would be.
Yeah, so this is a really good sort of point of nuance. I think these are two very separate systems and very separate ideas, right? One is like you're assuming that there is some sort of factual or like more or less truthful answer, and there is some kind of ground truth, right? And it's more like a truth-finding exercise. And then you can set it up as debate with this human judge. Now, there is another question. If you want to represent different opinions, you don't want sort of the same objective, right? It shouldn't be about winning a debate, but it should be about getting to agreement. And you can sort of incentivize these models in different ways for different problems by changing the way you reward their outputs and their behavior.
It makes me think about many things. I'm gonna really control myself and not go down the rabbit hole. Thank you.
Hello again. Tamsin Webster. So much of this reminds me of that slide from IBM that's been making its rounds on social again, where the first line says, a computer can never be held accountable, and therefore a computer should never make a management decision. And what I'm curious about in the context of this is, particularly since you're working on Manish, you talked about discrimination being context dependent, and so much of the work that Michiel, that you're doing is about how do we shift these frames of reference. I would say that in any given moment, those frames of reference are also context dependent. So I'm just curious, besides the fact that as far as I'm aware, that the learning literature has never really articulated what goes into a frame of reference, how you all are are establishing that and establishing the shift?
So for me personally, it is spending a lot of time talking to people who work directly in that particular area. So for instance, we have a bunch of work that we're doing now with surgeons trying to make better post-operative care decisions. I am not going to come in there and tell them, here's how we think about fairness in this space, and here's how I think you should be training machines to help you make better decisions. It's the other way around, actually. So we had been developing some methods to try to understand the sort of relationship between the predictions that we make and the actual decisions that doctors make. And the system that we've ended up trying to build looks completely different from what I would have envisioned if I had done this from scratch, right? So what we're trying to do is basically understand when are our predictions good, when are doctors actually making better predictions than us, and when should we sort of figure out who to ask or what information to present to doctor when they're making a decision, right? And so that is a very, very specific frame of reference. It's only going to work in the context of post-operative care for surgery. There's like very specific things that we're doing that are going to work in surgery that are not going to work in other situations. I think the hope for me is that as we build more and more of these little toolkits in different places, we see them start to generalize a little bit. So the work that I do in employment doesn't generalize very well to the work that I do with surgeons. It does generalize a little bit, actually, to some of the stuff that we're working with ER triage doctors, right? They are making decisions, we're making predictions in those settings. It's not surgery, it's slightly different. But we're starting to build a library of these examples that say, in this very specific frame, here's how we think about a problem. Some elements of that are transferable across. It still requires a lot of, I would say, manual labor. I mean, not manual labor, but like a lot of time and effort to figure out what is the right thing to take from this place and put over there. I don't think that we're going to be able to automate that anytime soon. But maybe I think the goal of a lot of this research is like 5-10 years from now, we can look at a particular setting, maybe interview a couple of the people who work there and figure out, yeah, I've seen this problem before. It looks just like that one. And so I think my initial hope coming into working in this area was that you would be able to come up with a really nice framework that works everywhere, and maybe you have to tweak it a little bit around the knobs, but it's an instance of basically the same overall thing. And it's been the opposite. You start at the bottom, you solve this thing, you solve that thing, you figure out what you did wrong, and you try to fix it over there. And hopefully, through many, many years, this bubbles up to something more general than it currently is now.
Michiel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like one thing which is maybe very interesting here is, so I did a bit of work in fairness and machine learning in my PhD, and I think what sort of Manish's recent work showed is, I think exactly what was missing at the time is that people were trying to come up with a very general solution, right? It's like, this is how we define fairness. We have some measures, and these measures, they work across domains, and we have some methods that work across domains. And I think what's really interesting about this work is that it sort of, instead of trying to come up with this like one measure, one framework, that it sort of embraces the fact that all these decision-making scenarios and all these industries are very different. And that creating sort of more specific solutions can ultimately lead to sort of a whole library of different solutions that then still come together and give a more holistic picture. But that's maybe a more productive way to try to address some of these issues and think about them than sort of how the field of fairness in machine learning was thinking about it sort of 5-6 years ago when I was doing my PhD.
Mm-hmm. Question over there? Yep.
Yeah, this is probably more a question for Michiel, but I'm just wondering, we're obviously in a very specific state of contending with mis and disinformation, and I'm wondering what your outlook is for, especially given the kind of work that you're doing, like, is there a positive future ahead as you think about this?
I think there are, like, generally for AI and generative AI, there are a lot of positive futures, right? Let me start with that. So I don't know if people have read Dario Modai's last sort of essay that made the rounds, but I was really sort of excited about that and excited to read that. And like, as someone that thinks a lot about safety and ethics, it's good to sort of keep in mind that ultimately this technology can do a lot of good. Then specifically on sort of misinformation, the the sort of problem is that to be a sort of helpful assistant, right? So to assist people and to be a better quote unquote chatbot, you need a very sort of good and refined understanding of human psychology, right? So a lot of what these models are trained for is to better understand what's actually helpful for people, right? How will people's opinions or perspective change as a result of showing them a specific statement? And obviously that capability of understanding human psychology and being able to sort of interact with people can be used to do a lot of harm, right? To do very large-scale phishing campaign or misinformation campaigns. There was a recent study from researchers at MIT that showed that these models can be used to reduce conspiracy theory beliefs. It was a very, very powerful and very positive result, but there's of course another side to that coin, that if you can reduce beliefs in conspiracy theories, maybe you can also move people's opinion in other domains. So I think there's definitely a big risk there, and these systems will get more and more powerful. There are a lot of closed source systems, but there are also open source systems that are easier to access. So we definitely as a society have to think about how we can sort of mitigate like negative effects and the risk of this capability. And I think one interesting thing is to build sort of systems that help people be more critical of the content they're reading, right? So one thing you can do is to try to detect misinformation. Well, this is very hard, right? And then it becomes sort of this attack and defense kind of dynamic. But you can also try to create systems that maybe live in a browser or live in a computer and that help people think more critically about the things they're reading, right? So maybe they're reading a paragraph about some product written by a sort of marketing professional that might even be an AI agent or an AI agent that is helping a human, but that is a very sort of powerful paragraph about why someone should buy a product. But then for the person that's reading this, it would be very helpful to have an assistant that, for example, highlights part of this paragraph and says, well, this sounds very compelling, but there is actually no evidence in this article that backs that up, right? So you could think about technologies that help people sort of, yeah, you can frame it in different ways, but like activate their system too, or think more critically about the things that they're reading and seeing. So I think with a lot of these issues, language models can both, and like powerful sort of generative AI can both make the risks higher, but also be part of the solution, or at least some of the mitigations around trying to control these risks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you both have a lot of
No, I
thoughts
mean,
on
one thing
this.
I'll just add to that is, I mean, you and I have both, and all of us actually had to take like computer security courses at one point in our life. And you can think of, and a lot of the questions that are being raised are, generative AI gives attackers a really powerful new tool against these vulnerable systems, human psychology being one of those vulnerable systems. And I think what you're proposing is trying to flip that around in the other direction and saying, yes, but it also hopefully gives defenders of these systems, ourselves included, more tools to try to protect ourselves against whatever attacks we see coming, right?
Yeah. I'm just imagining this system in the hands of peer reviewers as they're reading the papers and getting suggestions for how to critique them. So I want to leave enough time for everyone to get coffee and take a break. I just want to end with one question to each of you on the outro, and I want you to do it in this order, which is, what keeps you up at night about the AI age? What are you most worried about? And then what are you most hopeful for? What are the moonshot positive things that you're most excited about? So what keeps you up at night about it, and what are the potential amazing things that make you most hopeful?
Want me to go first? Yeah.
Or do you want
You go ahead.
Okay. What keeps me up at night? I think at the moment it's mainly misuse. So having very powerful actors, whether they are individuals or whether they're nation states, having access to such a powerful technology, right, that really has a very refined understanding of human psychology, but also of biology, of nuclear physics, of how to make weapons, is just a very sort of dangerous, could lead to a dangerous world, and we should think about how we mitigate some of these risks, right? So like misuse is definitely the main thing that keeps me up at night. And even though now if you ask a system like ChatGPT or Gemini to help with doing something malicious, the system will say, no, I won't help you with that. But there's plenty of work that shows that maybe you can use one smaller system that breaks down this task, this sort of larger, like malicious, harmful task into smaller tasks that look benign, and then use a powerful system to solve those smaller tasks, and then have the sort of weaker, but I guess, system without oversight to like put the solutions together again. So there are ways to sort of get around some of the safety measure that these AI research companies are taking. So that's definitely what keeps me up at night. Then what I'm excited about is, I think one is sort of AI for science. So DeepMind has done a lot of interesting work in AI for biology, but also in nuclear fusion, and sort of moving towards a world where we can live sort of healthier, longer, happier lives with access to maybe both better, but also hopefully cheaper drugs that can get to more parts of the world as the costs come down, having access to much cheaper energy. I think those kind of sort of technological breakthroughs that could be fueled by sort of powerful AI systems are definitely very exciting.
Manish?
Yeah, I'll second everything you said. I think on the risk, I think there's like a span from things that could go wrong today to like things that could go wrong 100 years from now. I don't really know how to think about the things that could go wrong 100 years from now. I think the 5 to 10 year horizon could look pretty grim. Like one of the things that I think keeps the social fabric together is that the power of the individual relative to the power of the collective has been limited. Like if you are a bad actor who wants to do a bad thing on your own, there's only so much you can do. Like you can do some pretty bad stuff, but there's only so much you can do. I think that ratio might be changing, and for many of the reasons that you described. And I think as that changes, we have a problem. I also think that there's just big questions about sort of children's development and growing up in an age where maybe you're offloading a lot of your thinking, maybe you're sort of learning to co-evolve with these AI systems. I don't know what that's going to do to a generation from now. Maybe this is the same thing as people being scared of putting calculators in the hands of kids, and ultimately that was fine. But maybe not, right? Maybe that changes quite a lot. And I think, yeah, on the positive side, there's a lot of people whose lives could be made a whole lot better. And I think that AI could be one of the technologies that enables us to do that, provided we don't do the bad stuff with it first. So I think there's a lot of stuff to be optimistic about, but I do think it's important to be very careful about how we get there.
Amazing. Thank you to our panelists. So we're going to take a bit of a break. You can finish your food, get some coffee, and we're going to start back up in 10 minutes here with the next panel. Thank you very much.